Hello, everyone. We are with Anne-Marie Gray today, CEO of USA for UNHCR, for WHF Talks Live as part of World Humanitarian Forum's digital series. We will be discussing how USA for UNHCR promotes leaving no one behind, sharing case studies where USA for UNHCR has collaborated with international partners, and of course, understanding how leaving no one behind is connected to other issues, ranging from education to connectivity. Welcome, Anne-Marie. It's a pleasure to welcome you today.
Many thanks to you, Freya, and to the World Humanitarian Forum for focusing on the global refugee crisis, which has increased significantly in recent years, and now, as with all global challenges, is even more acute during this global pandemic. The current refugee crisis is the greatest humanitarian challenge of our time. Today, there are nearly 80 million people worldwide who have been forced to flee their homes. This is an unprecedented level of global displacement, not seen since the end of the Second World War. And sadly, half of these refugees are children. More than 2/3 of the world's refugees, that's something like 77%, are caught up in situations of long-term displacement. The average refugee that's in a camp situation will now be there for close to 19 years. 85% of the world's refugees live in developing countries with fragile economies and health infrastructures. As I mentioned, COVID-19, the pandemic has really exacerbated what has already is a significant challenge to the ways we are addressing the global refugee crisis. The only way we can protect ourselves and our communities from this virus is if we work together to slow the virus down. The global pandemic requires a global response, and that includes refugees. We must ensure that refugees communities around the world are included in prevention protection plans, as well as vaccine distribution plans. And that means we've got to look beyond our country and ensure that we maintain our commitment to refugee communities around the world. For one thing, we have learned from this pandemic is that nobody is safe from this virus unless we all are. Progress made in so many important areas impacting refugees could be erased due to COVID-19. Unless bold action is taken by the international community to beat back the catastrophic effects of COVID on refugee education, that's just one example of significant need. The potential of millions of young refugees living in some of the world's most vulnerable communities will be further threatened. So, Freya, I thank you for keeping those issues at the top of the World Humanitarian Forum's agenda, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Great introduction, and it is very important to highlight the situation of refugees all around the world. And a key message, one of the key pillars to WHF is leaving no one behind. As a legacy of World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, it is one of our main messages we have been trying to really promote. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here on WHF Talks Live today, and we will have a chance to deep down into the conversation. Leaving no one behind is a key goal for UN SDGs as well, and 5 factors were considered to be vital to understanding leaving no one behind, namely discrimination, place of residence, socioeconomic status, governance, and vulnerability to shocks. Can you explain for our audience why leaving no one behind is a key principle to advancing sustainable development goals globally?
Well, thank you. And I think we can definitely apply the UNDP framework and the 5 factors that you've listed to the global refugee crisis and to the experience of many refugees. So let's take them each in turn. Discrimination or conflict spurred by racial or ethnic strife is often a reason that refugees are forced to flee. And in addition, refugees also face discrimination in host countries. They're treated differently. So their access to education, to jobs, to livelihoods, to health systems, ability to practice their religion, all kind of come under that heading. Place of residence. Well, refugees often find safety in the most isolated areas or in places without inadequate infrastructure. If I consider the refugee camps that I've visited or the communities when we look at urban refugee settlements, these are not in, often they're in unaccessible places, very difficult places. Nobody builds a refugee camp in a place anyone really wants to be. So that further exacerbates the issue. On the socioeconomic front, refugees are often some of the most economically vulnerable populations who have with little or no access to the job markets. In many places, it's simply illegal. The right to work doesn't exist for refugees in a host setting. Governance. Refugees often have very limited or no representation in public institutions and government, and they're often at risk of exploitation because of this. And then vulnerability, and because so often they lack that public representation and are economically vulnerable, refugees are even more vulnerable to systemic shocks to an economy as a result of natural disasters or because of conflict. So I think leaving no one behind is a key principle to advancing the SDGs, because we simply can't achieve the goals if we're not inclusive in our approaches or in our results to all people. And this really includes refugees. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, today around the world, there are nearly 80 million people who've been forced to flee their homes, their livelihoods, their countries. This is the largest number in history. So we're not going to be able to achieve SDGs if we don't include refugees. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, very, very good commitment and call to action, really. That there is nothing to be done, really, other than being inclusive. And really, we can't leave no one behind, especially in this time frame when everyone is talking about a global reset, and so we are, and also building back better. Refugees are definitely, and displaced communities, maybe we should say in general.
I think somehow that COVID has heightened that if we didn't understand that you need to include everyone if you're going to meet the SDGs in the time frame that's been set out, COVID has taught all of us that we're not going to beat this virus, if we don't include all populations. We're not going to address global challenges that the SDGs highlight if we're not inclusive of everyone.
Yeah, exactly. I can't agree more. My next question is about connectivity. COVID-19 has impacted all parts of our lives. And in an article, Mr. Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, wrote about mobile connectivity and stated that the refugee experience is in essence one of exclusion and disconnection. How important is connectivity to supporting other services such as cash transfers? And on the other hand, COVID has impacted the principle of leaving no one behind, as we discussed. For example, while children globally have moved to online education, this is naturally not always possible within a refugee setting. How has USA for UNHCR assisting with leaving no one behind within the context of education?
Sure. Well, I think first off, we've all seen, as you highlighted, how essential it is to live in a connected world, especially in the midst of a pandemic. On the most basic level, connectivity has ensured that people experiencing COVID-19 symptoms know when and how to self-isolate. They know how to reduce the risks of exposure to their family, to health workers, and to caregivers. And for the connected, some of the essentials of everyday life continue on. Children are learning through virtual classrooms. I'm working from home and have been since last March. Those that are fortunate enough to work from home have retained their livelihoods, and we stay in touch with friends and family over video calls. But for those that are not connected, they're living in a really different world, even more so during a pandemic. And the discrepancies are amongst the starkest in refugee communities. Accessing remote protection, education, livelihoods, and psychosocial support services isn't possible without access to mobile data. Lack of connectivity, further isolates already isolated refugees from their family members. I mean, when I travel and meet refugees, the most valuable possession they have after their documentation is often their cell phone. This is how people stay connected. So that lack of connectivity further isolates refugees from family members, who have left everything behind in a conflict and are often in difficult circumstances. Refugee communities are constrained to organize and empower themselves, and they're cut off from a path to self-reliance. Without connectivity, we also constrain the kind of transformative innovation in humanitarian assistance at a time when such transformation has never been more necessary. You specifically mentioned cash transfers, and that's important to call out because globally, cash assistance now accounts for a greater share of UNHCR's assistance than traditional in-kind distribution. Worldwide, about 20 million forcibly displaced people in more than 100 countries receive over 2.4 billion in the 3 years between 2016 and 2019. Now, if we look at a country level, in the DRC, for example, more than 60,000 internally displaced Congolese received cash assistance in 2019. The UNHCR has provided mobile phones and SIM cards to displaced Congolese families. That allows them to receive electronic payments. Mobile transfers allow UNHCR staff to maintain communication with them at a time when we need to be practicing social distancing. The bottom line is that digital connectivity should be a human right. It enables access to information, to education, to opportunity, to self-reliance. And for refugees, digital connectivity is often a lifeline to basic services such as cash transfers, how they can apply for a job or access online counseling or healthcare. And without safe and affordable access to the internet for every person, we will never achieve equity in many of the other areas which are highlighted in the SDGs. Further proof of that, it's really is in the UN Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation, and it calls for universal connectivity by 2030. We talked a little bit at the beginning about education. I think any of us that have children at home or have friends that are teachers, even here in the United States, we're seeing that connectivity is not there. We assume it is. But I have a community right next door to me in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where they are struggling mightily. And if we have that situation in the US, in the West, can you imagine what and how do you provide online education in a refugee setting? Restrictions on and the capacity for services always present challenges in addressing humanitarian crises and supporting refugees and displaced people. Over the last 8 to 9 months, in grappling with the pandemic, we've seen that this further exacerbates the challenges. And I think, Freya, you're correct. In that just as communities all over the world have been quarantined, staying at home and have limited services, UNHCR and our implementing partners have needed to take similar precautions to prevent the spread of this virus. And that's impacted all manners of services and access to education. Around 90% of the world's school-age children have had their education disrupted during this period. That includes an estimated 7 million refugees. And while children in every country have struggled with the impact of COVID on education, refugee children are particularly disadvantaged. Technology and internet access, that we've become so familiar with, and most US kids are using for remote learning, these aren't readily available in places like Kakuma or Dadaab. And the situation for young girls, where we've made such wonderful progress in changing the numbers of young girls and young women engaged in education, this is really bad. Refugee girls already had limited access to education. Half of the girls are less likely to be enrolled in school at all. But based on our data and a recent report from the Malala Fund, it's estimated that as a result of this virus, half of all refugee girls that were in secondary school, about 20 million, may not return to classrooms when they reopen. We're going backwards. When interviewed in the report, Malala summarized the risk very simply and very powerfully. She said, in a crisis like COVID-19, girls and young women are the first to be removed from school and the last to return. So just like educators here in the US and in the UK, UNHCR has been innovating and working tirelessly to maintain the continuity of education for refugee children and youth, doing that through radio programming in Dadaab, where online lessons are provided that can be accessed. In Uganda, where there is internet connectivity, but it's limited. We've been doing that through a learning platform called Colibri. We've done that in consultation with google.org. And then, further examples would be around the DRC in the north, where we are seeing classrooms that are outside, open air classrooms where there's social distancing in limited numbers. But I think we all have seen, to really leverage the power of connectivity, we've seen it in this crisis. We all need it, and refugees need it equally. And I think without it, we really risk our ability to meet the SDG goals.
Yeah, thank you for the that explanatory and full of numbers response, because it is quite shocking when you see with the numbers. I always say numbers can't lie, and it is quite shocking to see those numbers and figures. And we have always been discussing, like, many of the girls will not be able to return to school after this COVID pandemic, and it is becoming a reality. And as you have mentioned, we are really going backwards rather than onwards, and it's quite a worry that we are all carrying. You mentioned,
I'll just add a point there. Is I was able in late February, on the 21st of February, I flew to Bangladesh to do a mission trip into the camps near Cox's Bazar, and everything was just starting to break. We were in the States going, what virus? By the time we landed in Cox's Bazar, they were already doing temperature checks. But nowhere in the camp last February did we have internet connectivity. Now the government has since restored it, but how do you even prepare for a pandemic, let alone just keep your ongoing development work and humanitarian response work going when you don't have access? So it's very real. It's not an abstract. We need it. We take it for granted, and the minute it goes down in our homes, we start, panicking. Exactly. Imagine what it's like for refugees that are in very contained spaces and just trying to often keep in touch with family, loved ones, and access the most basic information.
Yeah, thanks to UNHCR. Such a great work.
And the government of Bangladesh that did restore it. So.
Exactly. As we've discussed about technology, I would like to speak a little bit about innovation. Innovation is quite key to all humanitarian assistance and international development work. And the localization of innovation by aiming to provide solutions using local resources is quite important. Refugee-led community-based solutions are also significant component to UNHCR's approach, as far as I know. And this has been particularly important this year, as we discussed during the pandemic, when INGOs haven't been able to enter the camps. How has USA for UNHCR supported these approaches?
Well, I mentioned that I had traveled to the camps to meet with Rohingya refugees back in February, but I think the response to the Rohingya refugee crisis is an example of where we see the shifting the relationship in a refugee crisis from one that's traditionally been, hey, we've got the answers, we'll come in and tell you what needs to be done, to one that's much more shared and grounded in the shared responsibility. With the support of UNHCR and NGO partners, the Rohingya refugees in the camps in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, have really helped to form a community-based protection approach. As you mentioned, we can no longer enter into those camps with the frequency that we had before. That was part of the virus containment approach. It was critically important to continue to give refugees the opportunity to have a measure of control over their own lives, to learn new skills, and to be part of the solutions and the protection programs that we were putting in place. So the refugees, were planned an active role in delivering the programs and services in the camps that was already in place. And then we were able to build off of that as it related to COVID protection programs. So the model, has given agency to members of the Rohingya community, volunteer groups in the I always say this wrong, Katapalong refugee camp. Let's just say the camps near Cox's Bazar that were under the UNHCR mandate. Really, the volunteer groups promote meaningful community engagement opportunities. And by the end of 2019, as I said, these programs were in place before COVID, nearly 50% of all the refugee community volunteers were women and girls. That's a real change from what they had experienced back in Myanmar. As I mentioned, I traveled to the camps, and one of the groups that has really left a huge impression on me was a group of very young women that I met that were really the frontline community health workers in that camp. So the group of women I'm referring to, it's their mission to connect with other refugees to provide access and referral to the health services that are offered in a camp. They're the ones that can diagnose if a child needs oral rehydration salts, if an older person needs the care at a health service, be it a respiratory issue, be it diabetes. Not only is that work vital to the health of the community, but it was really exemplified by one young woman I met named Salma, and we featured her in our recent newsletter. For these women, I asked them how do they feel about the service? They were so proud. This is the first time in my life that I've been deemed as a valuable member of my community. I am the front line. I am helping my community move forward and stay healthy. The experience of meeting with these teenage girls, some of them in their young 20s, also accompanied by the more traditional women who take on the midwife role, was really profound. Many of these women have experienced sexual violence, often gang rape, mutilation by soldiers. On top of that, they come from a culture that has traditionally denied women and girls having a voice, and often leaving them powerless in their communities and in their homes. And these young women are breaking through those limitations. As Salma said to me, she goes, whenever there is a lady with labor pain, they call me first. They know I will get them to the right health center and they will get the care they need. It makes me feel so very proud. Since the beginning of the pandemic, these community volunteers have been essential to helping stop the spread of the virus in their camps. In the early days of the pandemic, there was an 80% reduction in the humanitarian workers in the camp in order to reduce further transmission. They were stepping up, refugees were stepping up, building isolation wards, running community education programs on hand washing. Social distancing is not possible in these camps. They're so densely populated, but every day refugees are stepping up and making a difference, not only to fill the void, but also learning new skills about what it means to represent yourself, your community, and your people.
Yeah, that's great. Another big topic these days, inevitably, is around funding due to budget cuts in the countries, given the impact of COVID-19. Funding is tend to be an issue for many organizations. And this has been an issue we have been analyzing at length at WHF. And it is to do with private sector and philanthropic support for humanitarian programs. In addition to being a founding partner of the World Refugee Fund, which combines crowdfunding and microlending, how else has your organization supported refugees in advancing their economic empowerment? And with this in mind, can you provide some examples of innovative partnerships you had?
Sure. Well, let's look at the economic empowerment component of that question first. I think anything that allows us to improve livelihoods through economic inclusion is a key component to achieving protection and solution outcomes for refugees. And economic inclusion entitles access to labor markets, to finance, to entrepreneurship, economic opportunities for all, including non-citizens, in addition to vulnerable and underserved groups. Economic inclusion contributes to the self-reliance and resilience of refugees. It empowers them to meet their needs in a safe, sustainable, and dignified manner. It avoids aid dependency and negative coping mechanisms. And it contributes to their host economies, and we tend to overlook that. It's very important that, livelihoods, refugee livelihoods, economic empowerment can lift a host community as well. And ultimately, it prepares refugees for their future, whether they are the few lucky ones that are able to return home, or whether they integrate into a country of asylum or resettle in a third country. In 2019, USA for UNHCR supported the expansion of a local integration program in Mexico to relocate increasing numbers of refugees and asylum seekers from Central America that were largely on the southern part of Mexico. These were refugee seekers and asylum seekers, refugees from Central America and Venezuela, who'd arrived in those southern states. But in those southern states, the employment opportunities are extremely scarce. So we were able to support the partnering by over 50 private companies in Mexico who signed on for the program. And it resulted in the relocation and integration of more than 2,300 displaced families to dynamic cities in the north of the country that had that industrial infrastructure. So places like Guadalajara, Tijuana, Monterrey, just amongst a few. Now, as part of that program, displaced families receive vocational training, job and housing placement services. They receive legal support, psychosocial counseling if they need it, financial assistance, and school enrollment for their children. This support, in turn, has also provided a positive impact in the local economy. People that have gone through the program, they're in more permanent housing. They have permanent jobs. As a result, they're on a path to citizenship, and they're paying taxes. So this pilot program of displaced families has raised more than $1 million US in taxes and fiscal contributions. It is a true integration project. Now, the private sector partnerships, there's incredible opportunity to commit support for refugees and provide access to increased economic empowerment, as well as access to refugee education, strengthening infrastructure, and access to resources that are needed for refugees to become self-reliant. I've spent a considerable amount of my career focused on brokering partnerships with the private sector to support vulnerable people in humanitarian settings with Save the Children, with UNICEF, and as well as with UNHCR. And over 2 decades that I've seen remarkable growth, not only in private sector involvement, but the breadth, depth, and innovation of such partnerships. It's just tremendous how far it's come. One of the misconceptions by the humanitarian sector is that we should know and do know all the answers, and that's simply not true. There's so much the private sector can bring. There's so much, we've already talked earlier today about how much refugees can bring to the solutions for their own challenges. But one example, kind of the private sector knowing not more, but bringing different solutions is, often the private sector is at the cutting edge of technology. And if we're open and flexible, the private sector can play a critical role in contributing this expertise to forge new solutions. A recent example from my organization, USA for UNHCR, is our engagement with the Lighter Than Air Research Group. It's a cutting-edge coalition that's been focused on air transport issues. However, at the onset of the virus outbreak, they pivoted. I know, the most overused word in the English language, pivot, but they pivoted and were able to use their knowledge and their manufacturing contacts to produce much needed face shields for frontline health workers. They approached us at USA for UNHCR, and we were able to immediately identify at-risk locations with insufficient resources, such as Somalia and Rwanda, and dealing not only with refugee and displaced persons, but also with the impact of the pandemic in their host communities. We were able to manufacture very quickly to UN specifications and distribute using our logistics and their logistics expertise, to the countries that really needed PPE equipment. So I think it's that kind of creative thinking and a willingness to engage the private sector where they are on the continuum, and with the competencies and the skills and the context that they can bring to a humanitarian response. If you can work together, amazing things can happen. I think it's also important that agencies are flexible and recognize that while the traditional monetary donations are absolutely critical to support humanitarian response, there are so many other ways for the private sector to engage with us. Another example is for the past 9 months during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of apparel companies that have not had the opportunity to move their stock. Their retail stores have been shuttered. They were sitting on significant, in our case, clothing. I'm speaking specifically of Gap here. And while they were facing either liquidating the stock for cents on the dollar or burning it, in the case of Gap, they contacted us immediately. We'd had an established relationship. They donated their product for distribution amongst refugee communities as well as others in need locally. This is a game changer for us at UNHCR. We were dealing with used clothes when we could get it. We never can afford to include clothing in our critical care packages. It was a luxury. That sounds crazy. But while a clothing donation might sound simple, consolidating the product from 900 stores globally and all of the shipping and logistics is incredibly complex. We formed another partnership, kind of leveraging and highlighting innovation and flexibility and what we can do. We partnered with a US company called Good 360. They're another nonprofit to address some of the key challenges. And I would say this is a new way of working for a UN agency, but being more flexible in what kinds of goods we can accept from a domestic partner, using cause marketing to assist in the process-related costs, leveraging relationships as a multiplier effect for good by drawing in other large companies and nonprofits are all ways that we can be much more innovative. But we tend to be very bureaucratic at the UN, and I think partnership means shared risks, shared responsibility, shared outcomes. And I think ultimately we get some very, very innovative solutions to the challenges that we face in humanitarian response and development through partnership. But being flexible is absolutely critical. And that's sometimes hard in a UN environment.
I can fully understand, and it was a great example, to be honest. I think this can inspire many opportunities, hopefully, through the outreach we have. Please do not think from the standard ways of donation and partnership. Be innovative.
I mean, I always say we talk, and sometimes I see it from the private sector as well as, we have this off-the-shelf solution or product that you guys should be using in your development humanitarian response work. And I'm like, take a step back. What if you could leverage the core competencies, the talent, the innovation of a sector like technology? And if we can come together to solve those problems, instead of, don't hand us a package, we want to work with you to find new solutions, and we want to work with refugees. It's just a different way of working than we're used to. We tend to be so risk averse in the partnership space. I think we can be careful and risk aware, but I think, we can't do this alone.
Yeah.
Partnership is the way forward.
I agree. I agree. My last question before your closing remarks, I know we are almost out of time.
Yeah.
Is going to be about the narrative around the refugees. I think it's quite important. And one of the key issues we have been trying to address, which is the public perception around refugees. And we have been, as I said, trying to change the narrative, at least trying to put out the message. Oftentimes they are viewed with a degree of suspicion, which clearly does not reflect the struggles that refugees face on a daily basis. Changing the public's perception is also crucial to bringing further support to refugee issues. How has your organization aimed to change this perception?
I think this is some of the work that I'm most proud of, from not from myself, but for my communications and social media and my digital teams. Is we just determined when I started with the organization in 2014 that this is what we had to do. We had to stop telling a story of just need and, poor refugees need your help, but really want to talk about refugees as contributing to our communities, to our society. We tell a positive narrative arc of what we call help, hope, and home. And, every day refugees are starting over. They're making the best of it. They're trying to market their skills and learn new ones. They're trying to find work and opportunity. Most of them, if they're resettled or lucky enough to resettle in the United States or the West, are looking for a better opportunity for their children. So when we talk about changing the narrative, we have to resist those narratives that portray refugees as weak or a drain, and instead showcase their ambitions for the future and creating pathways for acceptance. For resettled refugees in the US, the last 4 years have been really hard. And in some areas, they face a misconception that they don't contribute to their communities, that they are a burden on the economy. And this simply is not true. A report from the New American Economy, a bipartisan research and advocacy organization, finds that resettled refugees pay billions a year in taxes and have a higher entrepreneurship rate than other immigrant groups and the US-born population. USA for UNHCR, this is a platform. We're a platform for lifting refugee voices. It's not about us telling resettled refugee stories, but rather allowing resettled refugees to tell their own stories, because they're far better storytellers than we are. And to quote Mustafa Noura, a former refugee from Somalia, who is now an entrepreneur in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he says, when you hear a refugee's story, it's going to be very difficult for you to hate them. A few years ago, Mustafa founded Bridge, a social enterprise platform where you can book cross-cultural experiences with local refugees to hear their story, enjoy their food, and build community. Refugees themselves are leading the efforts to change public perception. We need to be their amplifier, their bullhorn. Furthermore, in the past 9 months, we've seen former refugees' contributions to fighting the pandemic and keeping our communities safe, healthy, and functioning. They are, in so many cases, our frontline workers, working in essential jobs on the front lines to respond to this virus. An example of this is a former refugee from the DRC, Wakanda Musanangera, and Wakanda is a farm manager at the New Leaf Agricultural Group, a social enterprise in Elgin, Texas, which has been an essential food service to feed families in Texas during the pandemic. Former refugees are doctors and nurses, farmers, school teachers, among all of the heroes in this country who've been responding to the pandemic since the beginning, risking their lives and working around the clock for the past 9 months. We were really lucky in the lead up to the federal election, the presidential election here in the US, to amplify the stories of a number of resettled refugees who were voting for the very first time anywhere. And that is just another example of saying, why don't we show how they're contributing, the pride they have in taking out citizenship, the importance of a vote? What better people to tell those stories than people who have been denied a vote for all of their lives? So I think it's just finding those stories, really committing to tell a story of hope, resilience, and pride, and dignity. And that first and foremost is the mission of the organization. So I'm so glad that you've raised the importance of narrative and the role that each of us can play.
Thank you so much. Strong words. Thank you. And we are to the end to our conversation. I would like to thank you so much for your contribution. This has been a very stimulating conversation, and I think our audience will greatly benefit from this. But what are your last words and call to action, if you have, for the WHF community?
Sure. Well, as noted, the refugee crisis is the greatest humanitarian challenge of our lifetime. It's also a moral challenge. It's a call for each of us to play our part. Maybe it's listening to a refugee. Maybe it's helping to tell a refugee story. Maybe it's having a conversation with someone who's anti-refugee and just sharing and be willing to step into that space. But, despite the overwhelming nature of the crisis, day after day, I'm inspired by the thoughtfulness and compassion of supporters to USA for UNHCR. Every day, generous Americans give to help protect and empower refugees, and I'm grateful for their support, their gifts during this most uncertain economic period. And I'm truly moved when I read why they give. And often it's about, this is what it means to be a good person. This is what it means to be a good American. Now, some donors are former refugees. Others see shared humanity in the strength of refugee parents simply trying to provide a brighter future for their children. And still others are driven by faith. So I'd leave it to our listeners today, our participants, with the message that there are ways for everyone to contribute, especially during these difficult times. Individuals, communities, advocacy, organizations, and companies. And we thank you for your support, your kindness, and your compassion. We'd love to hear from you and talk about ways in which we can partner together in supporting, providing help, hope, and home for refugees.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for being part. We really appreciate it.
No, it was wonderful, and I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to raise awareness.
Thank you.
I wish you all the best during this season.
You likewise. Merry Christmas in advance and Happy New Year. And if there is anything that we can do to support your activities, we are always here. It's
well, let me know how it goes, and if you have any notes for me.
It was a fantastic conversation. Nothing to mention, to be honest. But any future partnerships, the WHF platform is yours. Just
well, I mean, I'd love the opportunity to showcase some of the wonderful partnerships we've had and some of the work we've done on, particularly in the empowerment space. I mean, these were great questions. So thank you and take care. You're in the UK?
Yes, I'm in the UK.
Where in the UK?
London.
I used to be with UNHCR when I worked with them. I was based in London, and I had a gorgeous flat in Primrose Hill. I miss it, but I think the London I miss may be very different. I was there until right before this job, so until September 2014. It's a wonderful city.
Yeah, it is a beautiful city to be in, but at the moment, unfortunately, we are unable to enjoy it.
Yeah, yeah,
With
same
the
here.
restrictions and everything going on. But we would love to welcome you here one day,
Yeah,
whenever
yeah.
the life is going to allow us.
Maybe in the spring. I'm hoping that there'll be a Chelsea flower show again and I can go back.
Hopefully, hopefully. And we
Yeah,
have WHF in London in May.
yeah.
Maybe we will be able to welcome you here back.
Oh, that would be fabulous. Freya, thank you so much for the opportunity. Please stay safe and thank you. Bye.
Bye. Take care.